Hello, dear viewers. I'm back with a new video essay. It's been a while. A bit of some new branding too while we're at it. I hope that doesn't confuse anyone. I figured Ashley at the Lum-chan Chronicles had a nice ring to it. So anyway, let's get started. The state of education, particularly the humanities, is in shambles. Am I really saying anything new with this, however? Well, maybe about this particular locus of people. You see, I read an abhorrent amount of English and Japanese papers about manga and anime. And while the Japanese papers aren't quite so bad, an overwhelming amount suffer from the same early 90s feminist brain rot that's trickled down to popular culture today. Some of you may be confused by that statement. Hey, aren't you a lesbian? Aren't you a feminist? Yes to both of those questions, so rest assured, I'm not merely being a pick-me. And what I am referring to is a hyper-specific thing that illustrates quite the neo-semantical drift. To the point that feminism, as it used to be and should be, is something of a metanonym now. At least in respect to academic discussions and analysis of anime and manga. I began noticing this as I joined the academy and started researching and writing papers several years ago. My first exposure to feminist analysis of anime as an adult, at least enough to cause confusion and perhaps alarm, was this paper about the Utena movie. This woman declared that it's not a film about lesbians at all, but tearing down gender and sexuality. To start, there is the continual erasure of lesbians in media analysis. All one has to do is look at the pitiful joke of an academic journal that is the Journal of Lesbian Studies. We are being told that despite the very obvious homosexual reality on screen, it is not only a vehicle for the political ideology that the author has interpreted, but it entirely invalidates it as being what is shown. It shows this woman doesn't really know much about show frontrunner Ikuhara or his preoccupation with lesbians. Needless to say, this guy is a bit of a weird pervert that really likes lesbians. I don't think it's wrong to say he writes, albeit haphazardly, about being unconventional. How that unconventional behavior is okay. But the narrative is very explicit about how that's accomplished through homosexual relations. Maybe Anthe is bisexual and not a lesbian. Same with Utena in the film. Who cares? But the point is that their homosexual relationship is a central theme. It's paramount. This is blatant from Ikuhara himself as well as the film just playing on its own. Sexuality is not being erased, which is impossible, as Ikuhara stated the metaphor is actually about growing up. Hence the title, The Adolescence of Utena. How do these people miss such obvious things? These are the academics getting paid to analyze these works. Incredible. Oh wow. The adult world is dirty and impure. Like this woman seems to imply the Western perception of lesbians in the film is. The fantasy Utena resides in is childhood. Gender and sexuality are not erased because they beat Anthe's incestual rapist brother. Also note the claim that Utena is masculine. We'll get into this nonsense in a moment. If sexuality can be erased, so can lesbians. Way to out yourself as a bigot, Miss Feminist. Ryoko Ikeda. She created the very series that Utena is based on, The Rose of Versailles. Bara no Versailles. A beautifully drawn story about a girl raised like a boy who goes on to become a big deal in the French court. Now, Japanese feminism in the 1970s was kind of a joke. It was leveraged between consumerism and individualism, with many going after the former. Because women buying appliances can totally achieve independence and their own place in the world, right? In any case, Ikeda is well known for adding a lot of Yuri elements into her stories. but don't be fooled. She is anything but pro-lesbian. Lady Oscar rebukes her female love interest on basis that homosexuality is not as serious or correct as heterosexuality, which culminates in her entering a relationship with a man. So while in America, feminist thinkers were arguing that maybe, just maybe, romance is a bit of a distraction to placate women into domestic slavery after World War II, Ikeda has the brilliant idea to disavow homosexuality and have her heroine that defies stereotypes end up in the arms of a man. This is not a unique theme in The Rose of Versailles, but consistent throughout most of her manga, which we'll also get into momentarily. Feminist academics have this idea that Freudian or Jungian archetypes, ideas that don't even work in the soft sciences, are suitable for media analysis. I've written a lengthy essay as part of a book's manuscript that I haven't overall finished yet, responding to an inane paper by a supposed male feminist. In the paper, this man, David E. Roark, quotes his contemporaries, women who insist that any sort of woman that isn't a hyper-stereotype is either not a woman ideologically or a very masculine woman. He goes on to use the term phallic woman, which is just gross. The examples? Ripley from Alien, Sarah Connor from Terminator. I mean, the guy even goes on to insult both women's appearances and say they look like men. I know the film's called Alien, but you don't have to reach for the stars, buddy. Instead of acknowledging that women are people and these stereotypes are very old and tend not to be relevant, these academics use them as a baseline for what women are. These really dumb, socially arbitrary ideas that men forced on women in the past a few hundred years or less ago, that feminists have been fighting against since the days of Mary Wollstonecraft and Susan B. Anthony, have become the baseline. I should clarify, no, I don't mean misogyny was invented a few hundred years ago, but rather the sexual stereotyping of oppressive femininity or masculinity, as it's referred to in these papers, is so damn precarious that it's not the same thing at all. Especially not if you go back thousands of years. And speaking of Wollstonecraft, she argued that men oppressed women by refusing them access to education, which in turn made them deficient toys for men. This is backed up by her male contemporaries, such as Rousseau, who believed women should be educated in traditional roles of femininity. It's worth noting that Rousseau also believed women were not naturally stupider or lesser than men, but it was merely for the good of society that they were to be subjugated. Penny A. Weiss has a wonderful paper on this topic and shines as an example of what feminist scholarship should be. Unlike, say, Camille Pagula, who believes Rousseau's social basis hypothesis is wrong and seems to champion him as some sort of feminist hero that all feminist discourse is based off of. I digress. If we are to employ the logic of academics like Roark, then would Wollstonecraft not be pushing for women to be phallic women? For them to basically be men? Or is that not relevant because we've overcome some of those hurdles? But if so, then the masculine is not an absolute abstract, and this entire line of reasoning falls apart. Anne Hollander has a fantastic book by the name of Sex and Suits, wherein she theorizes that women's fashion has always lagged behind men's and thus imitates it. So the acceptable box of women's dress has widened significantly over time, and what was once seen as masculine is now normal and even feminine. Are you beginning to see why these Roark-esque academics and their rigid theory of stereotypes as any meaningful metric is bad scholarship? It makes no sense. Instead of a woman just being a strong woman, she is simply a phallic woman, a woman who is metaphorically and ideologically male. Instead of a woman being successful in accomplishing things, she is ideologically male because to be a woman is to be weak and submissive. They have taken the category of woman and defined it by misogynistic stereotypes. Naturally, women do not tend to be okay with this. I'm not. My friends aren't, and nobody I've asked about this is either. This is why I find the truth to be that these feminist academics if women are self-hating. That or they're appealing to other misogynists to have some semblance of a career. I've written a lot of papers criticizing these things, and they're difficult to get published because the misogynistic cult of postmodern and post-structural feminist thought is sacrosanct. One wrong step and you're blacklisted. It happens all the time to women, and it's been going on since the 90s. I mean, ideally, probably since the 60s if we look at things like the Lavender Menace. Still, it has been for about 40 to 50 years now to be feminist to degrade what a woman is because of Foucaultian ideas employed into the idea of gender, that our sexes are irrelevant, and that everything about people is contingent on power dynamics. And thus we are defined as lesser or greater on that basis. It's an awful framework with no real basis in reality. So what happens when you reject their axioms as a whole? Well, they either rely on language tricks or try their best to remove you from the academy. Noam Chomsky really hit the nail on the head when he said these people are jealous of physicists. This is where that nonsensical term, non-woman, came from, because a French writer, Monique Wittig, ran crazy with the notion that we are defined by power dynamics, and so a woman is a slave by definition. Again, if I don't agree with your definition and reject it, if society as a whole does the same, then what? Then you're stuck in your ivory tower writing papers that get 3 citations, feeding the feminist Borg in your shitty little niche you claim passes for education. French philosophers have really done a number. Derrida had some good ideas such as deconstruction, but he too fixated on Freudian notions and built on them. Phallocentrism was originally an idea by Freud about the symbolic power of the male genitalia. Derrida decided to build on that as an abstract. Why? Why create fixed abstracts that you can grab? Why not discard a bad idea and start again? That's part of the problem here, and it's very much so a reason Roark has alleged to grab onto in the academy. I'll simplify all of this. You have a woman. She is not an abstract, but a physical entity. She exists. Societal expectations do not define her physical existence. More to the point, inconsistent societal expectations spaced over the past 100 years that are not all applied the same or exist in the same relevance absolutely do not define her physical existence. Why would that be your barometer? Why would you create a topology and force reality into it rather than creating one based on reality? Ego. If a woman does something cool, why does she have to be defined by a man? As a man in some capacity. Feminism was originally about liberation from male control, and so how does predicating the existence of women's behavior, or even the entire essence of their being, on men accomplish that? How does making feminism androcentric become feminism? It doesn't. Take women's pants, for example. It's entirely normal for women to wear pants in 2024. It's been that way for a long time. But according to the logic of these academics, women that wear pants are indulging in cross-sex behavior. It is masculine for them to do so. Why? Because at one point women were relegated to not riding horses and staying in the village and thus had no need for pants? And since then men oppressed and forbade women the opportunity? History proves with relative ease how the contrived masculine is not an abstract to grab, but instead an imposed idea by people wanting to uphold the supposed patriarchy they want to abolish. At what point to these people do we abolish the oppression of a concept? At what point is wearing pants simply neutral as it is in reality? These are not ideas congruent with reality, and that's the problem. With that said, we can move back to the Rose of Versailles. That same ridiculous level of academic analysis is present here as well. Deborah Shamoun, which Wikipedia declares is a manga scholar, makes the nonsensical claim that Oscar's heterosexual relationship is only biologically heterosexual and is socially homogender. In essence, a woman who does not conform to stereotypes is masculine, and so then basically a man. Therefore, she is socially gay. Do these people hear themselves? Like, seriously, did they not hear the misogyny and homophobia oozing from their regressive mouths? 19th century sexologists collect, they want their bullshit back, please. Because Andre is tender and sweet and fights evenly with Oscar, sometimes losing. He is emasculated. It's just ridiculous. It's using a regressive framework as a baseline. Why? Ikeda's own writing is absolutely misogynistic in a similar vein, but that's not how text is contextualized in the real world. Back to Wollstonecraft. Would she be gay for kissing a man while wearing pants? I had an abnormal psychology professor that would absolutely argue that, by the way. It's ridiculous. This woman literally argued in some cultures she'd be a man just for going through menopause. Absolutely ridiculous. Look at how our manga scholar here denotes the stereotype of unrequited female love. Stereotypes are everything in this world, even if they're wrong. Men never feel unrequited love, really? Even though they're going through a loneliness epidemic? That's also a stereotype conveniently left out. Not only that, this is all historically wrong. Social standing was everything in this era. It would be normal for a man to pine after and feel this unrequited love for a higher status woman. Similarly, even if the love wasn't unrequited, I should mention that the power dynamic would seem more in the woman's favor, as that lower status man would be marrying into her family. Patrilineal or not, her only real argument seems to be that it resembles the aesthetics of what would become boys' love. Interesting when you consider Oscar rejected women. So it's rejecting heterosexuality for homosexuality, even though in reality it's the complete antithetical to that, but okay. Sure, even if you want to argue that the aesthetics are similar because it was influenced by Ikeda's work, there's still nothing actually gay about a straight man with a straight or bisexual woman who isn't a fucking doormat. Give me a break. I also fail to see how Ikeda is challenging assumptions about heterosexuality. Why? Because Oscar isn't some pornized sex doll? Because she looks a bit androgynous? Ideas of femininity change, but Oscar is physically feminine, and that biological aspect operates independent of these social stereotypes. Hiding her breasts in your art during sex scenes and acting like she's sexless isn't challenging anything, because sexual attraction in and of itself is biological, which is therein denied as her writing shits all over homosexuality. These scholars, much like Ikeda for the third or fourth time, act as though masculinity and femininity are absolute constructs one can grab, but they're actually precarious abstracts meant to divide us. A masculine woman is still a woman, and a woman indulging in supposed masculine activities can still be feminine without stereotyping. Funny how that works. Another terrible example is how Ikeda wrote Oni-sama which has Mariko's boundaries completely violated. Her protesting basically means she wants it and isn't actually a lesbian. Yeah, a way to subvert the patriarchy, Ikeda. Mission accomplished. I have a hypothesis that if her art wasn't so pretty, that no one would really care about her stories in 2024. I think for a moment it would be pertinent to look at Ryoko Yamagishi. She's credited with arguably the first Yuri manga, which I'll make a video about later, but for now let's focus on why she made it. Yamagishi stated that she had a weird interest in gay male romance, as many straight women do, but instead tried to curtail it with something more acceptable, lesbian romance, which her editor in Ribbon magazine said was fine. In truth, there was a dichotomy of what a lesbian relationship could be in Japan earlier on from that era that Yamagishi borrows tropes from and so forth and so on. It was normal for girls during the late Meiji and early Showa periods to enter relationships. The girls would garner experience and learn to become acceptable women as time went on throughout their education, which is a very Rousseauian concept, just Japanese and called Rosai Kenbo. Basically, the girls were expected to grow out of it and utilize it for their service to men. This was dosei-ai, or same-sex love. It wasn't pathologized, at least not initially. Around the same time as the homophobic sexological idea of sexual inversion was imported from the West by psychologists, the analogous butch femme dynamic was absolutely pathologized because a physically or socially appearing masculine woman was a threat. She was taken more seriously, which is why she would often use the veneer of the Takarazuka theater to act in the way she pleased, which in turn was also the catalyst for many women finding out they enjoyed playing the male role, or otakoyaku, and could thus pursue women in a straight-appearing relationship, classified as ome no kenkei. This was pathologized and seen as deviant and in need of correction. The woman in this role would want to blend in and continue living with her female partner, enjoying the benefits that males would normally receive. Gentleman Jack, anybody? It's almost as though when women are severely oppressed, they try to blend in as men in order to enjoy the same liberties and freedoms. Crazy. Anyway, without going too much into a history lesson, Yamagishi would borrow these fleeting girlhood loves that would happen between lower and upper-class men. Upper-class women? Whatever. The story would additionally resemble the same thematic end as lesbian pulp novels in America. Tragedy. What I can admire about Yamagishi beyond her art is that she does what Ikeda doesn't. She doesn't force her lesbians to be with men and then say it was wrong. Anyway, between the 1920s and 1960s, ideas changed, and the idea of lesbian romance, perhaps as long as it ended poorly, was far more acceptable than the idea of two men together, which would change as much in only a few years' time as straight women began to become fixated on proto-yaoi, a long jump away from the dosei-ai novels of yesteryear. But perhaps not so much Yamagishi's work. I digress. How would Yamagishi's girls, how would Simone be analyzed if from some academic 30 years prior? They'd probably say what scholars are saying now about Ripley, Sarah Connor, and Oscar. That she's masculine, that she behaves like a man. Never mind the fact that acceptable behaviors and borders for these constructs in their niches, the rebellious teenage girl in this case, shifted entirely by the 1960s and 70s. So in a stereotypical way, Simone's behavior is completely normal. Hence context sensitivity. Hence the ephemeral nature of socially defined, stereotyped frameworks. Hence proper real-world contextualization. Just like in the 1920s, lesbians were seen as male in some capacity. Because why? Well, men like women. Sexually. So women that like women sexually must be men in some capacity. Do you see the non sequitur and why this logic doesn't add up? A lesbian is a woman who likes other women sexually. Both are naturally occurring. It's taking from an existing worldview and creating a concept on that basis without room for the idea that these things may operate independently. It's some weird backwards skeuomorphic concept. At least that's the way it appears to me. Suppose feminists that borrow from the very ideas that have had women and lesbians persecuted and actually oppressed and then using them in the same fashion under the thin veneer of feminist theory. Heavy sarcastic emphasis on theory. You don't understand what's different, so you project your own image onto it. To say it bluntly, it seems at every glance I'm unfortunately met with American or French influences in academia. And Japan is no exception. This woman here, Asuna Kato, utilizes Adrienne Rich's lesbian continuum as a means to bolstering lesbian visibility. In 2016, Adrienne Rich's whole thing was an inflammatory response to Betty Friedan. Friedan basically argued that lesbians had no place in the women's movement because regular people would associate feminists with ugly butch lesbians. Rich decided to expand the idea of lesbian past what it actually is, because she was a political lesbian. And she didn't believe that women had innate homosexual attractions. Just sexual attraction to men for breeding purposes, and motherly nurturing attraction to their children. In essence, unscientific nonsense that contradicts the lived experiences of lesbians everywhere. It's lesbophobic by its very nature. The continuum allows straight women to be lesbians because it's a choice to them, one where they don't actually have to have sex with women. It's about how being a lesbian is some new age spiritual nonsense where everything but romance and sex exists. The Japanese have been importing Western ideas consistently since the Meiji era. But it's important to note that simply because Western concepts have been imported does not make them the norm, nor does it make them indicative of the unique lesbian culture there. Similarly, these Western papers analyzing Takarazuka and lesbians of the late Meiji through early Showa periods, using Judith Butler, are entirely anachronistic in their application, as well as ethnocentric, but that's a whole nother issue. It is, once again, a problem of forcing reality into your box, rather than analyzing it simply as it is. I'm getting a bit off topic here, but hopefully I've illustrated the fundamental problems with these schools of thought and why they're the exact thing they purport to be against. Go ahead and smack that like button if you think these people's ideas are as stupid as I do.